History is rarely shaped by a single decision. It is shaped by countless events, occurring in different places, at different times, until they finally collide. By the beginning of 1917, Britain wasn't simply fighting Germany. It was fighting mathematics. Every week brought new military offensives. Every offensive consumed millions. Every million pushed the treasury closer to its limit. The war had become a race between the battlefield and the balance sheet. Yet while ministers struggled to finance an empire, another man was quietly solving a completely different crisis. His laboratory stood hundreds of miles from the front lines. But the work taking place inside would influence the course of the war, and, eventually, the future of the Middle East. His name was Chaim Weizmann. Unlike many political leaders of his era, Weizmann wasn't a soldier. He wasn't a banker. He wasn't even a career politician. He was a chemist. Born in what is now Belarus, Weizmann had established himself as one of the brightest scientific minds of his generation. By the outbreak of the First World War, he was teaching chemistry at the University of Manchester. At first glance, his research appeared to have little connection to the conflict consuming Europe. But wars have a way of turning obscure scientific discoveries into matters of national survival. One of Britain's greatest military problems wasn't a shortage of soldiers. It was a shortage of something far less obvious. A chemical, acetone. To most people, acetone is an ordinary industrial solvent. In 1915, it became one of the most valuable substances on Earth. Because acetone was essential for manufacturing cordite, the smokeless propellant that powered almost every British artillery shell fired during the war. No acetone. No cordite. No cordite. No ammunition. And without ammunition, even the world's most powerful navy becomes vulnerable. Before the war, Britain imported much of the raw material needed for acetone production. But Germany's naval blockade and wartime disruptions cut off those supplies. Suddenly, factories slowed. Production targets slipped. Military planners began worrying about something almost unthinkable. What if Britain simply ran out of ammunition? The government urgently searched for alternatives. Traditional manufacturing methods were painfully inefficient. Producing acetone from wood required enormous quantities of timber. It was expensive, slow, and nowhere near sufficient for modern industrial warfare. Britain needed a breakthrough. Fast. That breakthrough arrived in the form of bacteria. Weizmann had developed a fermentation process using a microorganism called Clostridium acetobutylicum. Instead of relying on scarce raw materials, the process converted starch into acetone on an industrial scale. What had begun as academic research suddenly became one of Britain's most valuable military assets. When Winston Churchill learned about the discovery, he reportedly wasted little time. According to Weizmann's own account, Churchill asked him a simple question. "We need 30,000 tons of acetone. Can you make it?" The challenge was enormous, but Weizmann accepted. He left university life behind. Working closely with British industry and government, he helped scale the process into full production. Factories were rapidly converted. New fermentation plants appeared. Before long, Britain's ammunition crisis had eased. Millions of artillery shells could once again roll off production lines. Few people outside government circles understood the significance. But inside Whitehall, Weizmann's reputation soared. He wasn't merely another scientist. He had solved one of Britain's most urgent wartime problems. That achievement opened doors few outsiders could ever hope to enter. Cabinet ministers knew his name. Military leaders respected his work. Senior politicians welcomed him into conversations that extended far beyond chemistry. For Weizmann, scientific success became political access, and political access became influence. It would prove invaluable, because while helping Britain solve its military crisis, he continued advocating another cause that had occupied him for years. The Zionist movement. Unlike earlier generations focused primarily on settlement and philanthropy, Weizmann believed lasting security required international recognition, support from a major world power, official backing. The timing could hardly have been more significant. Britain desperately needed allies, desperately needed influence, desperately needed every possible advantage. And Weizmann now occupied a unique position. He could speak as both a respected scientist and one of Zionism's leading representatives. Soon, those two identities would become impossible to separate. By the summer of 1917, Britain had reached a crossroads. Its armies were exhausted. Its finances were stretched to the breaking point. Russia was collapsing into revolution. American troops had entered the war, but they had not yet arrived on the battlefield in meaningful numbers. Time was running out. Every decision made in London carried enormous consequences. Military victories alone would no longer guarantee survival. Britain needed something more. It needed allies, influence,
money,
and every possible strategic advantage before Germany could recover its momentum. Meanwhile, Chaim Weizmann's influence inside Whitehall continued to grow. The scientist who had helped solve Britain's ammunition crisis now found himself speaking with ministers about something far beyond chemistry: the future of Palestine. It was in this atmosphere that conversations already taking place behind closed doors suddenly gained extraordinary importance. For years, British officials had maintained informal contact with leading Zionist figures. Now, those discussions became official. On February 7, 1917, representatives of the British government met with leaders of the Zionist movement. Among those present was Sir Mark Sykes. The name may sound familiar. Only a year earlier, Sykes had secretly negotiated the Sykes-Picot Agreement, dividing large portions of the Ottoman Empire into British and French spheres of influence. Now, he found himself discussing an entirely different future for Palestine. The contrast was remarkable. One year Britain had secretly negotiated territory with France. The next, it was discussing promises to Zionist representatives. The diplomatic puzzle was becoming increasingly complicated. Yet Britain continued moving forward, because every possible advantage mattered. As negotiations progressed, Foreign Secretary Arthur Balfour became more directly involved. Unlike some politicians who viewed Zionism with skepticism, Balfour believed the movement deserved serious consideration. His motivations remain debated by historians. Some point to genuine sympathy. Others emphasize imperial strategy. Many argue both were present at the same time. History rarely offers simple explanations. What is clear is that by June 1917, events accelerated dramatically. On June 19th, Arthur Balfour made an unusual request. He asked Lord Walter Rothschild and Chaim Weizmann to prepare a draft declaration expressing British support for a Jewish national home. Pause for a moment. Think about what that meant. The British government wasn't merely writing a diplomatic statement. It had invited representatives of the very movement receiving the promise to help draft the wording themselves. Few diplomatic documents begin that way. The first draft proved ambitious. It proposed that Palestine should be reconstituted as the national home of the Jewish people. Inside the cabinet, the wording sparked debate. Some ministers worried it went too far. Others feared international consequences. The language was gradually softened. Words were removed. Phrases carefully rewritten. Every sentence was weighed. Every adjective mattered. Diplomacy often turns on individual words, especially when those words may shape the future of entire nations. Behind these discussions stood another important reality. British leaders weren't thinking only about Palestine. They were thinking globally. Could public support for Zionism strengthen Britain's standing among influential Jewish communities in Britain, Europe, Russia, and, especially, the United States? Cabinet papers from the period show ministers openly discussing possible political and strategic benefits. Some hoped such a declaration might encourage stronger international support for the Allied cause. Others believed it could reinforce Britain's long-term position in the Middle East after the war. No single motive dominated every conversation. Instead, financial concerns, military strategy, imperial planning, political calculations, and personal relationships all became intertwined. The result was diplomacy unlike anything Europe had witnessed before. The declaration continued evolving through multiple revisions. Every department wanted changes. The War Office had concerns. The Foreign Office suggested modifications. Legal advisors examined the language. Cabinet ministers debated every phrase. Weeks turned into months. Outside government buildings, few people realized history was quietly being written. Inside Whitehall, one document passed from desk to desk. One paragraph, 67 words. Words that would outlive every politician who debated them. Finally, the cabinet reached its decision. On November 2, 1917, Arthur Balfour signed the letter addressed to Lord Walter Rothschild. It read, in part, His Majesty's government view, with favor the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people. The declaration also included an important qualification. It stated that nothing should prejudice the civil and religious rights of the existing non-Jewish communities in Palestine. Those words would become the subject of intense debate for generations. Supporters viewed the declaration as a historic breakthrough. Critics argued it promised land Britain did not yet control. Neither side could fully anticipate what would follow. Because the declaration itself did not create a state, it did something far more subtle. It transformed an aspiration into official British policy. And once an empire commits itself to an idea, the consequences can echo for centuries. History remembers the Balfour Declaration as one promise. In reality, it was only one of three. And that changes everything. Because while Britain was assuring Zionist leaders of its support, it had already made commitments to others. Different people, different governments, different expectations, all involving the same region. To understand why the Middle East remains one of the world's most contested regions, you have to understand these three overlapping promises. The first began in 1915. At that stage of the war, the Ottoman Empire still controlled much of the Middle East. Britain desperately wanted to weaken it from within. The solution seemed straightforward. Encourage an Arab revolt. If Arab leaders rose against Ottoman rule, thousands of Ottoman soldiers would be forced away from the main fronts. It was a gamble Britain was willing to make. So London opened negotiations with Sharif Hussein bin Ali, the Hashemite ruler of Mecca. The discussions took place through a series of letters exchanged with Britain's High Commissioner in Egypt, Sir Henry McMahon. Together, they became known as the McMahon-Hussein Correspondence. The message was simple: support Britain's war against the Ottoman Empire, and Britain would support Arab independence after victory. Exactly which territories were included remains debated to this day. The wording left room for interpretation. Some British officials later argued Palestine had been excluded. Many Arab leaders believed the opposite. For Sharif Hussein, the promise seemed clear enough. He accepted. In June 1916, the Arab Revolt began. Across the deserts of the Arabian Peninsula, Arab fighters attacked Ottoman railways, forts, and supply lines. One British officer would become especially famous during the campaign, T.E. Lawrence, better known to history as Lawrence of Arabia. Lawrence helped coordinate operations between British commanders and Arab forces. His reports praised their determination. His writings later transformed the campaign into legend. Together, Arab forces captured key cities, disrupted Ottoman communications, and tied down thousands of enemy troops who might otherwise have reinforced other battlefronts. They believed they were fighting for independence. Many expected Britain to honor its word. But even while those letters were being exchanged, another negotiation was unfolding, in complete secrecy. In May 1916, British diplomat Sir Mark Sykes met his French counterpart, François-Georges Picot. Their objective wasn't Arab independence. It was something entirely different: the division of the Ottoman Empire. Using maps spread across conference tables, they drew lines dividing future spheres of British and French influence. The agreement became known as the Sykes-Picot Agreement. Large portions of the Middle East were allocated between the two European powers. Some regions would fall under direct administration, others under political influence. Palestine occupied a special position. Rather than assigning it exclusively to Britain or France, the agreement proposed some form of international administration. Exactly what that meant remained intentionally vague. One thing, however, was unmistakable. The agreement conflicted with expectations created by Britain's discussions with Sharif Hussein, and that was precisely why it remained secret. Had Arab leaders learned of it during the war, the revolt might have collapsed. Trust would have vanished. Britain couldn't afford that risk, so the agreement stayed hidden. For now. Then came 1917, and with it, the third promise, the Balfour Declaration. This time, Britain expressed support for establishing a national home for the Jewish people in Palestine. 3 years, 3 commitments, 3 different audiences. Each believed Britain was acting in good faith. Each expected something different. The contradictions weren't immediately obvious. because each promise served a different wartime objective. The correspondence with Hussein encouraged revolt against the Ottoman Empire. The Sykes-Picot Agreement secured cooperation with France. The Balfour Declaration sought strategic and political advantages as the war entered its decisive phase. Viewed individually, each decision appeared understandable. Viewed together, they formed a diplomatic maze that no one could fully escape. For decades afterward, historians, diplomats, and politicians would argue over which promise carried greater legitimacy. Each side found evidence supporting its position. Each interpreted the documents differently. Yet one uncomfortable reality remained. The people actually living in Palestine had played almost no role in negotiating any of them. Their future was being discussed, drafted, and debated thousands of miles away, in government offices, conference rooms, and private correspondence. History often speaks of treaties, but treaties rarely ask permission from those whose lives they transform. But history rarely ends with a single document. The Balfour Declaration had been written. The promises had been made. Yet the greatest consequences still lay ahead. Britain would soon inherit Palestine. Millions fleeing persecution would change its future. An empire would struggle to keep control. The world would witness another global war. And from its ashes, a new nation would be born, alongside a conflict that continues to shape our world today. The final chapter begins next.